Hello, and welcome to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Marketing Podcast, the show where we help you establish your author brand, increase the size of your audience, and sell more books. I'm Lindsay Baroker, and I'm here with my two co-hosts.
I'm Jeff Poole.
I'm Joe Lalo.
And we've got a great guest for you this week. In an unprecedented month here, we've got two traditionally published authors in a row, but don't you indies worry, we'll be back with some with indie authors next week. But our guest is Nalini Singh. Did I say that right, Nalini?
Yep, perfect.
Awesome. I tried to spell it wrong every time I emailed you. Throw an H in there. But for those who don't know, she's a New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of the Psy Changeling series, Guild Hunter, and Rock Kiss series. She lives in New Zealand but travels as much as possible. The travel bug hit her hard when she escaped working as a lawyer to run away and teach English in Japan. She loves to write, loves to read, and thinks chocolate is a food group, which it totally is.
It totally is.
There's so many different kinds. It must be its own group.
I like to weigh in here, and of course, you're right. I agree. I'm a chocoholic.
Excellent. And we're going to be talking paranormal romance tonight, and also what it's like publishing and promoting when you're in like New Zealand or another smaller country, and a lot of your audience is in the US. So she's going to talk a little bit about some challenges and how to overcome them. But to start things off, why don't you just kind of introduce us to yourself and tell us what your road to publishing was like?
Oh, that's a long and complicated story. But
you have 7 minutes. I'm timing you.
It was 7 minutes. No, so I started quite young. I decided I was going to be a writer, but I kind of didn't know any other writer. So this is pre-internet, before everyone really had the internet, in their homes and stuff. Pre sort of any kind of like the Kindle boards or anything like that. There's nothing. I was completely in isolation. So I thought, well, I'll just write the book and then I'll figure it out what to do with it. And I ended up, at the time, the only publisher that was really accepting things outside of like the US was Harlequin. They were the only publisher that was really accepting submissions from, like New Zealand and Australia and all the other little countries. So I rang up a distributor in New Zealand and I said, how do I send them my book? And they're like, we've got this sheet they gave us to send to people. So they sent me this form that had like their submission guidelines, and I submitted to London, and I was 18, which tells you why I was so totally confident that they were just going to love it, because at 18, you're like, woo, I'm amazing. They didn't love it, so that didn't quite go as I planned. But I always say I'm so proud of that book because I finished a book, and then because I'd finished it, I had the confidence to know that I could, finish a book. So I just kept going. I just kept submitting, writing, submitting. And a few years down the track, I was published with them. And then a couple of years after that, that's my breakout book was Slave to Sensation, which actually went to auction. And that was really when my sort of career took off. Yeah. So that's the shortened version. Less than 7 minutes even.
Excellent. You're going to be a good guest, I can tell. Are there agents and publishing in New Zealand, or did you think to do like Australia, or was kind of the US just always the goal?
So New Zealand has, New Zealand has publishing people, but I think at the moment there's something like 2 agents in the country for fiction. And at the time, and even now, there weren't really any publishers publishing what I was writing. The authors I was reading, they were all coming out of the US or the UK. And the New Zealand market is really very literary, publishing very sort of New Zealand fiction. And so there wasn't really room for genre writers. So we had to go offshore. That was the only choice. And also I should mention it's a very small market. So if you only publish in New Zealand or Australia, it's quite difficult to make a living. You really have to spread out. Yeah.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my first question. Is so local authors didn't really cater to the niche that you wanted to write for. Do you find now that maybe having reach? You say it's a small market, but do you feel like you've got a good, strong foothold in your home market, or do you still want to focus primarily elsewhere?
I do think I have a strong presence in New Zealand now, but it's by far one of my smaller markets, and that's just a simple fact of numbers. Like we were just talking before, that New Zealand has 5 million people, across the country. That's the population, as opposed to, I think the US is over 200 million. So that just tells you the kind of numbers you're working with. And because then of that 5 million, there's going to be a percentage that read, and then a percentage of that will read what I write. So yeah, I definitely have a presence in New Zealand now, but my strongest markets are still overseas. Yeah.
And you said that most of the stuff you were reading, or the stuff you were interested in, was coming from the U.S. You feel like sort of being raised in the same literary diet as the U.S. helped you to write to the U.S. market a little bit better?
It's not something I ever tried to do consciously, but I remember when my books sort of went on submission and came out, there was reviewers and others said, you have an international voice. And I assume that came from probably what I read growing up, but it wasn't a conscious choice.
All right. So obviously being in New Zealand and writing for the New Zealand, Australia markets there, I mean, are there any differences to the whole publishing process? I mean, if someone like a new author was to come up to you and say, hey, I'm getting ready to write my first book, I don't live in the US. I mean, is there any sort of like tips or advice you give them to say what to do or what not to do?
I don't think really, honestly, at this current time, it makes any difference where you are because of the internet and everything you can do on it. Like, my editor that I work with most often, my US editor, she's in New York. My agent is in Los Angeles. And we've had a really long relationship. And there's no reason you can't publish worldwide from New Zealand. I also have a number of friends who are very successfully indie published from New Zealand, and all the tools. I should say there is a couple of caveats to that are available to, say, a US author, are available to a New Zealand author. Now, the caveat is, for example, ACX, the audiobook production, I think that's right, that's not open to like Kiwis. But now there's like another group, Findaway, I think, that's opened itself up to Kiwis doing their own audiobooks. So there were a few roadblocks there that I think are sort of dropping little by little, and that's on the indie side. And on the traditional side, I don't think there's really, I guess my one point would be to not hold yourself back and say, well, I'm based in whichever country it is, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, I can only submit to the publishers here. I think there's no need for that. You can submit to a publisher anywhere in the world. And the same with agents.
All right, that's awesome. And I think Nook was the same way, and maybe they still are. You can submit directly to them unless you had a US account. And at least Draft to Digital and Smashwords and those guys came along as an option, as a way to get in. So what are your thoughts?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
No, go for it.
All right. What are your thoughts on kind of the paranormal romance genre as a whole right now? Is it doing well? Is it on the wane? I know these things are kind of cyclical, but for those wanting to get in it, any thoughts?
I think there's
on the
always
state?
room for new voices, I think it's quite funny. I always say paranormal. So when I started, they were saying paranormal is dead. And I always say paranormal is not dead. Paranormal is the undead, so comes back, always comes back. And I think there's always room in the paranormal genre. It's so wide. There's so much room in it to tell different kinds of stories. So yeah, I think if that's what you want to write and that's your passion and that's the story you can tell, then definitely go for it.
Do you feel that traditional publishers are actively looking for it right now?
Ooh, that's a hard question, because obviously I'm coming from a point where I'm established with a publisher, so I'm not as in touch with what perhaps the submissions they're looking for. I would say, to guess, I would say probably it's not being acquired as strongly as probably the stronger genres right now. Like contemporary, I think, is very strong at the moment and probably still being acquired quite strongly. With paranormal, I think you'd have to have something quite different to break through.
Do you feel that the agents and publishers now are like, oh man, not another vampire? Or do you have, is that kind of what you mean? Do a different sort of, not species,
Yeah,
is that the right word?
No, I don't think you have to come up with like a whole new thing. Like you could do vampires, but just vampires with a twist, Like even when I did my Guild Hunter series, which has vampires in it, but it's archangels control the world in that. And that came again at a point where everyone was like, oh, vampires, too many vampires. But that did really well because it was a little bit different. So I think it's going to be harder to break through if you're doing the same thing everyone else is doing to stand out. And I don't actually think it makes a difference whether you're traditional or indie. That's going to be the same because it's about building a brand and who you are as a brand, and it's harder to differentiate yourself if your brand is exactly the same as someone else's brand. If that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. And so, like you talk about, you need to differentiate yourself. How do you develop your stories? Like, do you have a folder full of ideas, or does every plot start from scratch for you?
I tend to let things bubble in my brain for a really long time, and then suddenly something will be like, oh, this is kind of cool, and I'll start writing it. Like, for example, with the Angel's Blood, I started writing that while I was writing the Psy Changeling series, and I just did it in the evenings after I'd done my real work for the day, kind of thing. And it was a weird little idea. It was archangels ruling vampires. Oh, how's that going to work? And I just wrote it. And the one thing, and I think this is really important, is especially in today's market, is that sometimes you have to just let ideas grow naturally. I think quite often I hear writers talking about marketability before the book is written, before they've come up with a concept. And I think it constrains people quite a lot. I think sometimes if you give yourself room to just go with the crazy idea, you can come up with some really, really cool things. And that's what most of my ideas tend to come from. I tend to play with projects behind the scenes. And then once, it's written, that's when I figure out, okay, what am I going to do with it? Who can I sell it to? Or can I publish it myself or whatever? Those questions come after.
It's good to know. And like, have you ever sort of abandoned an idea because you felt like it didn't differentiate itself enough, or it was too far off, or too far out to potentially sell?
No, not really. I always give it a go. The only thing that leads me to sort of stopping a project or like playing with something and going, oh, it's not going to work, is when I'm not into it. When it becomes a grind, and I don't want that. I want to be excited by the idea. I want to be, oh, this is cool, and have fun with it.
Okay, so when you're writing, do you maintain a strict schedule? Like, just like, okay, I'm going to be here sitting in front of my computer, 8 hours a day, or do you just prefer to write whenever you feel inspired?
So I have deadlines, so I need to be disciplined because, for example, my June 2018 book is already on pre-order. So if I don't turn in that book on time, all the marketing, everything falls over. So for that reason, I am organized. But
so strict schedule it is. Got it.
No, not the way you think. It's like I'm organized, but what I was going to say is every day I'm not militant about what my daily schedule is like. So, for example, I hate running errands in the weekend because there's just crowds everywhere. So I will take, half a day off in the middle of the week to do my errandy stuff, and I'd rather work that half day in the weekend. So I'm quite flexible in terms of how much work I do in a day, but as long as certain guidelines are met or like certain goals are met every week, so then I don't get all stressed out towards the end. I'm not one of those people who's like feeds off that deadline energy that I just get really, really stressed out. So I'd rather do my work like every week. Okay, I've reached this stage, and okay, I've reached this stage, and and then I can hand it in,
A lot of
sane.
people see, that's what you have to expect, that when you live in Middle Earth, you realize that.
Yeah, that's right. There's magic and sparkles in the air all the time.
Well, you do have those glowworms. They sound kind of
That's
like
right.
fantasy novel-ish.
They're amazing. Honestly, you go in and it's complete darkness, and then the roof of the cave is just carpeted with glowworms, and it's indescribable. It's amazing.
Have you said any of your stories in your home country?
I have actually. My Rock Kiss series, which is self-published, has one book partially set in New Zealand and one book set fully in Auckland, which is where I live. And there's a book coming out in November, which is also set in Auckland. So, yeah.
All right, you got to use some of that, some of those glowworms and cool scenery and stuff in the books.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'm curious, I've asked some other guests this, what your thoughts are on the difference between paranormal romance and urban fantasy, and if readers just enjoy it all, or if you do find that there's quite a line in which that people don't like to cross.
I personally think it's like a really gray sort of separation. There's some urban fantasy that's more paranormally romancy, and then some paranormal romances that kind of cross over into urban fantasy. In terms of what the distinction is, I think the distinction I think of straight away is that paranormal romance tend to have one romance per book. So you have a couple and then they get their story, and then the next book will have another couple, even if you have an overarching storyline. Whereas urban fantasy quite often features sort of one main character and their journey or adventure or quest, and then you have the love interest, and then sometimes you have the two love interests, in the triangle going on. And then the romantic storyline tends not to be resolved until the end of the book arc, whatever it is, 6-book arc, 10-book arc, however long it is. I think that's sort of like the basic, in my mind, that's a division. But as I said, I think there's sort of genre crossing books there. I'm going to use my Guild Hunter series as an example. It's labeled paranormal romance, but there have been multiple books about the same characters and couple, and their love story didn't sort of finish in one book. So as I said, it's a really gray line, and I think sometimes it's kind of a marketing choice. And I think in my case, it was because it has such a strong romance that's why it's sold as paranormal romance as opposed to an urban fantasy. Yeah.
Do you find it hard when you're doing the romances where it's like kind of a couple per book, because that your series, The Psy Changeling, is quite long now? How do you keep do you keep it new and yet people want to read the next one, maybe because you already introduced the characters earlier? What's the secret with a with a long series like that?
The Psy Changeling series, I think one of the things that makes it so strong is the overarching storyline that connects it all. The background story is very strong, the politics and all of that's going on. And so the couples come out of that. So each couple that takes center stage does something to move that overarching storyline forward. And so the story is always moving forward. And I think that's critical for a long-running series. In terms of the characters themselves and their relationships, I tend to think of my characters, as people. And just like real people, they're all different. So that part's more sort of a natural thing that just happens when I sit down to write.
All right, sounds cool. I just did kind of this with my pen name with a 5-book series, and I found that was challenging enough to keep the story going for more books than that would be. Hats off to you.
You have to definitely have to keep really, really good notes, because continuity is key. Because I'm a big series reader myself, and I am that annoying reader who will know if you made a mistake, or if you changed a rule. That's a real, because I think as soon as you change a rule, you lose all the tension in the story. And so I try and not do that. I try and maintain the tension throughout and stick to the rules, even if the rules make it very, very difficult sometimes.
Yeah, you're stuck with something that you made up in book 1.
That's right.
I remember listening, I think I might have mentioned this on here before, but listening to the DVD commentary on Stargate SG-1, and they were like, in the first episode or whatever, we made up this Zach Nicotol or something ray gun, and like 1 shot stunned, 2 shots killed, and 3 shots made the guy disappear. And then they were stuck with this weird rule about disappearing bodies. I think they kind of stopped disappearing after the first season, but it was like, be careful what you make up.
Yeah, that's right. And but the thing is, I think a lot of, like, for me, it's like the Side Changing series was my first series, and so I kind of learned as I went. And so I'd written the first book, and then I was like writing the second book, and I was like, oh, okay, I can't do that because I said I couldn't do that in book 1. So then I was like, so it was kind of a crash course in continuity, but I have to say it makes writing really fun as well, because you can't just go off and to do whatever you want. There are corners you have to write yourself out of. And I have to come up with solutions to problems that are quite creative, because I can't just take the straight way out because I said I couldn't. So, yeah.
Definitely. And I see that you kind of participated in this serialization thing with several other authors. It looked kind of interesting. How did that come about? And was it challenging and fun, or was it tough?
Okay, so I think you're talking about Lord of the Abyss, right? And the Royal House of Shadows series. So this is interesting. I actually think a lot of indie writers are doing something very similar right now, just in a different format. And so what happened was Gina Showalter, who headlined that, I think it's quartet, she was going to do this quartet for Harlequin, and she got to choose her fellow authors who she wanted to invite, that she would really love to be part of it. And she asked me, and I thought, And at that time, I was doing the Side Changing series and the Guild Hunter series. But I thought, you know what? First of all, I really like Gina. She's a cool person. So I was like, yeah, I'd love to do this. But also, from a marketing perspective, I was like, this is going to reach a whole new readership, because Harlequin Nocturne, they have their mail order readers who get their books, every month. And so that's like a whole new different market than I was reaching with my single titles. And so, yeah, so I decided to do it. And then as for how we did it, it was all through email. Basically, this was an author-run continuity, which meant we got a blank slate and we came up with the backstory, and we each assigned where we were going to be in the storyline, and we assigned the characters. So we came up with the characters. And when I say assigned, it's like we came up with the family, and there were this many children, and each of us took a child, and then we created the character ourselves individually. And where the books crossed, so there's scenes where someone else's character came into your book. So I would write the scene if it was in my book, but then I would send it to the other author to check, to make sure it was in their character's voice. So that's how their character would act. And yeah, and that's how it came together. And it was only 4 books. And we made the storyline quite kind of linear, because with the 4 books, you can't kind of get too crazy, which made it easier. But there's hundreds of emails, hundreds and hundreds. And the reason it was on email was just so we could always do a search and find information. And yeah.
Overall, do you think that collaborating with another author or other authors was like educational? Did you learn anything, I don't know, plot construction wise or even marketing wise?
I always find other authors interesting. Like, I like listening to, like author interviews and podcasts like this. It was educational in terms of seeing how other people work, because as a writer, I just know my process, and so it was kind of interesting to see how other people do things. And I also figured out that I'm not really a natural collaborator. So I really like to control things as far as the writing goes. So I find it quite difficult to collaborate with someone else where they're making decisions on the story and things like that. But yeah, for sure, I think I did learn things. I couldn't sort of tell you pinpoint one thing, first of all, because it was so many years ago. But I think it was just a cool experience, and seeing that we could construct something together from the ground. And I think if authors have the chance to do it, definitely give it a go. But the one thing I would say is make sure it's people who have the same work ethic as you, because all four of us were very, dedicated. We turn in things on time and do the work. And I think that actually is critical to failure or success, is if everyone is on the same page work-wise.
Yeah, it seems like in any given group, there's a tendency, if one person has a particularly strong personality or one person is a particularly weak one, or just there's a tendency for the collaborative effort to suddenly just become one person steering a ship, which is far less useful, I think, overall. And,
Because
go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing. I was like, because with a collaboration, the goal is to showcase everybody. And so if one person's voice dominates, I think that takes away from that.
Yeah, and I also think, like, I like the idea of a collaboration. I also like the idea. There's a cartoonist named Chuck Jones, and toward the end of his career, he started having little personal challenges, like, well, how do I grow as a storyteller? Let me start limiting myself. And once you start having to work within a framework that you're not the only one building, it seems like it will be, it's exercising a new muscle, which is important for authors.
Yeah.
Okay, so before I ask my question, I do have a question for you from one of our viewers, a lady by the name of Jen Holland. She asks, back on what you're saying a little bit before, she goes, question, does she get much pushback on the love triangles if she does those ones?
I actually don't do love triangles because I can't stand them. And now, of course, in the future, I'm going to write a love triangle, and then someone will say, but you said you can't stand love triangles. But it's generally not something I'm drawn to. I'll read them, actually, if they're done well. But I personally don't do them. I do know other authors who've done them, and it's been fine. I think it depends whether you're in urban fantasy or paranormal romance. Probably it'll be harder to pull off in paranormal romance, whereas in urban fantasy, it's more sort of accepted. Yeah.
Alrighty. And my question for you is, looking back on your writing career, is there anything you wish you would have done differently?
Ooh, no, because I'm happy where I am now. So it took all of that, whatever has happened, to bring me to this point. So I'm a big believer in looking forward, as opposed to looking back.
Good answer.
All right, well, let's kind of roll into the marketing half of the show. And those who are not familiar with your books may go peek on Amazon and see that they're selling quite well, and you've got hundreds of reviews on everything. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. I am really, my readers are amazing. They're just fantastic, and I have to give them a shout out for all the reviews and everything.
Awesome. Do you do anything to try to get reviews, like giving out art copies, or is that something your publisher handles?
Yeah, so the publisher handles sending out all the art copies, but if there's someone, certain reviewers or something that have missed out, that have been reviewing me for a while, and I can just always drop them a note and say, hey, these guys, can you make sure they get a copy or something like this? Obviously, there's a lot of requests come in, and so can't always get everyone a copy, but we try and be sort of open to newer people as well as older reviewers. And with the Rock Kiss series, which I do myself, that one I send out the review copies, or my agency can get a NetGalley spot, and then the review copies come out of there. But yeah, I think it's important to get the books in people's hands ahead of time to get those reviews. Yeah.
And I'll say from experience, you should do it more than 2 days before the launch is ideal.
Oh, yeah. I'll just say something on that. Because I came, I'm with traditional publishing, I've learned to have review copies, go out very early, like 3 or 4 months in advance of the book release. And there can be benefits to that in terms of getting reviews that have a longer lead time for example, on some blogs or magazines, things like that if you want. I know most indies work on a much shorter schedule, but even if you can get it out sort of a month ahead, I think it does help, because it just, not everyone will be able to read your book in a week and get up a review. So if you really do want to open with a strong set of reviews already on your first day, then it's worthwhile sort of planning ahead and getting your arcs out there.
Yeah, especially with the book one, where you're really hoping. I mean, because it is impressive when you're just a reader looking for something, and you're like, "Wow, that book has 100 reviews, and it came out Saturday."
I think when it's a book one, you really have to do a reach out. Like with my Rock Kiss series, because it's a contemporary, it's a contemporary series, which is not what I'm known for at all. We did a massive reach out, personally, to like so many bloggers, so many reviewers saying, hey, would you like a copy? And not everybody said yes, and that was fine. I don't take anything like that personal, it's just, okay, they can't, so move on to the next person who might enjoy it. So yeah, I think particularly with the book one, you have to sit down and consciously plan out who you're going to reach out to, and what kind of reviews you'd like to get. And by that I mean, do you want like a bunch of Amazon reviews? Do you want Goodreads reviews, blog reviews? Do you want all of that? I think it's good to think about it.
Have you found that being on blogs and I guess sites out there like that is helpful for sales? I think a lot of indies will just kind of focus on Amazon and maybe Goodreads, because we know BookBub looks at those sites, and it's maybe easier to get to. Traditionally, it's been harder for indies to get reviewed by some of the kind of bigger blogs out there.
I have a special place for bloggers in my heart, because Slave to Sensation, it had great word of mouth, and that was because of bloggers. It was just so many people blogged about it, and Dear Author was one of the first blogs, and back then, they were not huge, but they were, getting bigger, and they did this amazing review, and then they did kind of like a contest, and it got on a whole bunch of other blogs, and so I will always have time for bloggers, and I think they do such an amazing job, because these are people who love books, and I do think they still have a place in the current climate, because bloggers have an audience that trusts them. So they might have 400 people that follow their blog, but those 400 people trust the voice of the blogger. So if you get a review on a blog, obviously it's harder to measure return on investment, but it's kind of like getting your friend telling you, hey, this book is awesome. You're probably more likely to sort of listen than if some ad, like a random ad flashes to say, this book is awesome. You're more likely to believe the person whose voice you trust and who has given you good recommendations in the past. So I do think, if you can get material on blogs, not necessarily reviews, if you can get an excerpt, featured on a blog or anything like that, I think it's worth it. And I think it's okay to focus on smaller blogs as well, because a small blog might only have 30 followers, but that's 30 people who maybe didn't know about your book before you got something up there. The one thing I don't think is very useful is when you have to write a whole bunch of content for blogs, because that takes a ton of time, and for me it's too much time. I very rarely will do an actual post for a blog. I will get review copies out. I will do excerpts, things like that. But actually writing new content each time, that's I don't think that's a good investment on time. Yeah.
Yeah, we had Brian McClellan on last week, and he said the same thing. I think you try it all when you're with your first book, and then you realize, wow, that took a lot of time to do all those guest posts.
Yeah.
And we don't necessarily talk about book bloggers that often on here, but I have to say because I've drifted away from it just because I usually publish as soon as the book's ready, so I don't have it don't get it to them with enough time. But one of my first, I remember the Fantasy Book Critic blog, which is a pretty big site. Usually they do traditional stuff, and they're still going strong. They reviewed one of my first books, and at that point I was selling so few books that I was like, whoa, look at, like 10 sales a day. I mean, it totally made a huge difference. So I would agree, like that one's a great one. And then probably for the paranormal romance and stuff, I'm going to mangle it. Smart Bitches Trashy Books. I don't know if you've been featured on there, but they have a huge following.
Yeah, they have a huge following. And one thing I was going to say, you don't necessarily always have to just send new material out. I know previously I've reached out to bloggers and said, hey, this book's already out, but you guys have never, if it's not something you've read and would like to, I'd be happy to send you a review copy. So I think you can even do this with stuff that's already out. And you want to see if, a book blog will feature you, because like the Smart Bitches, they quite often will review books that are, already out. They don't do just new stuff. So you got nothing to lose by asking.
Yeah. I've had a little bit of luck with that, sending out books. I mean, several years old at one point. If nothing else, I find that the reviews that you get are much more like thoughtful and in depth from a blogger than you would get from, obviously a customer review or anything like that. All right. So earlier we were talking about this, how you basically we're all from the internet. It doesn't really matter where you're from anymore. Do you do any offline promotion at all, or is basically everything on the internet now?
Let me think. I do stuff. So I have a New Zealand publisher now. So even though I'm a Kiwi, I was published a lot of places before I was published in New Zealand, but I do actually have a New Zealand publisher now. And they will occasionally ask me to do things. So for next week, I have a release, and I'm going into a warehouse to sign a whole bunch of books that have been pre-ordered, and so those will go out signed. And so that's kind of cool. I like doing that. And a few years ago, I did like a book tour around the US for my US publisher, and I've also done book tours for my German publisher and French publisher. And generally, aside from that, and those don't happen that often, I think as we all know, there's things are changing in the publishing industry and in terms of marketing and everything like that. Other than that, probably just the conventions that I occasionally go to, that's sort of on the ground stuff. And I actually do one thing, which is I mail out a lot of books. So I do a lot of giveaways from New Zealand, and we'll send them anywhere in the world, because honestly, unless it's going to Australia, the postage is all the same to me from New Zealand. So yeah, we just recently posted something out to Gambia, I think, or so, which is pretty cool. But yeah, other than that, I think most of the stuff I do is online.
Yeah, I've found it seems like the physical stuff and meeting face to face, it's a small but memorable thing. Like I just 2 days ago, I received my first orders for autographed books in like 2 years, and I emailed the person just to let them know, like, hey, I got your order. I wasn't sure that my order form even still worked. And the reaction you get from somebody who was like, oh wow, this is really like, it seems to me like a lot of people don't realize an autographed book is actually autographed. Like there's a lot of people who just consider it just another product, like with a rubber stamp. And I feel like while it's not a big portion of your return on investment, the physical stuff and the face-to-face stuff can really make an impact sometimes.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think so. And I think often the people who come to conventions and things are like the super uber fans, and they're the people who are going to really talk about your book everywhere. So it's worth making the effort to, if you can, to do those kind of things when you can. Obviously, you have to limit it at some point, because I'm in New Zealand. I can't fly out for everything. It's a really long way. But when I can, I really enjoy it. And I think you have to go into it with that mindset that all these connections you're making, they're fun and they're enjoyable and they're important to the reader. And I think as a writer, like you said, you get so much out of it when you meet someone face to face that really loves your work.
All right. Do you feel an author should maintain a presence on social networking platforms? I mean, if so, are there any you favor or avoid?
Yeah, obviously. I love social media. My career is based on social media. So obviously, coming from New Zealand, from the first, I had to be very, very smart with how I used social media, and I had to reach out because, as a new writer, no one was going to send me on book tour. And this was when I started. So my first book came out in 2003. This is when people were being sent on these huge sort of book tours and stuff. But I was like a newbie. No one was going to do that for me. And because I lived so far away from my market, I wasn't going to be able to drive around the stores and sign books for, all the bookstores. And what I ended up doing was sort of buying not a buy. There was a lady and she compiled like a list of bookstores and things, and you could send them book plates and bookmarks and things. So that was kind of the start of social media, so to speak. Even though it was offline, you were connecting to people through this list that was online. And anyway, I do think social media is excellent for reaching readers because most readers aren't, they're not going to live in your town or even your city. So it's a way to connect to people who are all over the world, different places. But I think you should only do it if you like it and if you actually enjoy it, because I think it comes through if you're really reluctant about social media. As for me, I really enjoy Facebook. I joined Instagram more recently. I do enjoy that also. I tend not to, let me see. And I'm also on Twitter. And Twitter for me is more conversational. I tend to talk to a lot of other writers. I'll send out promotional stuff and I'll answer reader questions on that. But I don't think of Twitter as like a marketing thing. When I'm on Twitter, I'm just playing. I'm on Twitter. In terms of reaching the majority of my readers, aside from my mailing list, so I'm a big proponent of the mailing list too, I should say. But on social media, probably my biggest reach is through Facebook. And for whatever reason, that's where the majority of my readers follow me on social media. And I have fun with it. I enjoy it.
How often do you write something on Facebook? Like every single day, or is it just whenever you've got something to share?
I try and do it sort of once a day, but that's not always possible. And I do have an assistant now, so every so often she will put stuff when I'm like in the deadline cave. And everyone knows her because she's been my assistant for a while, and also she's my sister. So so she will post as herself, but she's really well known, so it's very personable. And so we try and do it sort of 5 days a week, and then every so often I'll post something in the weekend, and usually it's a video or something else funny that a reader has shared, and I'll just share that because I think that's kind of cute for a weekend. So the most recent one is like a caracal cat and a leopard and a panther cat. They're baby ones. They're all having a fight. It's so cute. So yeah, in terms of Twitter, on Twitter I tend to be on and off. Usually it's when I'm on a break from, I've done my writing and I'm just like, oh, I've got 5 minutes. I'll just go on Twitter. Yeah. And Instagram, it's very, I don't post regularly at all. It's just whenever I feel like there's something cool.
Okay, good deal. All right. Yeah, I think that's it for me. Let me hand you back over to Lindsay here.
All right, I've got a dog bathing in the background, so hopefully no odd licking sounds will make it through. So let me slip in a question from Twitter, from Julia, since we're talking about Twitter. Now that two of your two series have grown so much, how do you manage your series Bibles?
So, so like I said, when I started, I kind of learned crash course in like the whole series Bible and having to keep notes and things. And I started with like binders, physical binders with notes. And I've always based things off the characters because that's how I remember things. So there'll be a character and then it'll be how that character is connected to the other characters and all the notes that relate to them. So a lot of the stuff is through the characters. And then a few years ago, I thought, especially the side-changing series. It's huge. It's huge, and I thought it would do like a wiki, a private wiki that I could access. So we set that all up, and it was great. It was amazing, and I never used it because when I write, I turn off the internet and I turn off anything except Word. I still use Word, so I'm one of the few people in the universe who is still using Word to write my books. And I don't like the interruption. I did not like going onto the wiki to check stuff. So it's gone back to the folders. I have these binders, like these massive binders, and honestly, it's just a case of having them updated, keeping them updated. And I used to do it all myself, but now my assistant does a lot of it. So I wrote, for example, the book that's coming out next week, the lead character is Venom, and so she did like Venom Manifesto, she calls it, and it kind of had links to every time he was mentioned or any facts about him, and so that's really, really helpful. And then the binders, I still do a lot of work on that, putting the maps in, any other details. So it's just putting aside the time after writing each book to put the details in to the binder, and also, of course, checking the binder as I'm going through to make sure I have, all the correct information.
Wow, physical binders.
I know. I'm really analog.
I did my first few books in Word too, and I didn't really do a story Bible because I was just like, oh, I'll remember everything. But now that I'm years later and people are like, oh, will you go back and write another book in that series, I realized I would have to reread and kind of make a story Bible as I went along. Now I'm a lot better, and I like Scrivener because you can, just have it all in the same file over there. But good to know. It's actually, I love the idea of the physical binder. I'm just too lazy to do it. But kind of back to marketing stuff, you mentioned newsletters. What are some of the things you do to encourage people to sign up for yours?
Okay, so the biggest thing I do is I write free short stories for my newsletter people. So when I started the newsletter, for me, I was like, I can see your dog, it's so cute. For me, it wasn't just getting people onto my newsletter. I think that's just the first step. For me, it's always been, I want people engaged in my newsletter. So I want them opening the newsletters that go out. So I thought, well, as a reader, what would I like from my favorite authors? And, I want the cool behind the scenes stuff. I want the deleted scenes. I want the little free short stories about, particular characters. So that's how my newsletter is set up. When you join, you get sent like a welcome newsletter that has links to all the stories that aren't available anywhere else online. And then, every newsletter, I try and have something special in there that is different to what you can get online. Every so often I can't because of deadlines or whatever. And if that happens, I usually make up for it in the next newsletter with maybe, like the last newsletter I sent out was kind of like a bumper edition. There was like a huge excerpt that was available nowhere else at that point. And there was like a really big short story that just went to newsletter subscribers. So, and as a result, my engagement and open rates are really, really high. I really didn't want to have like this ginormous newsletter and then that you have to pay to send out and then only like 15% opened it. For me, that's not something I wanted. I would rather have a more compact newsletter that has grown more organically, but the people are really engaged. So
that's good to know. Like short stories for newsletters is something I do as well. It's very nice. I got a question. This is a New Zealand US difference question, but we've had people on the show talk about how there's a big price difference between the United States and Australia and New Zealand for things like paperback books. And
yep.
Does that factor into your marketing at all? Does the extreme price difference, and like, do you push ebooks more in Australia and New Zealand as a result?
No, not really. With the traditional stuff, the ebook prices are high as well. So, the reader can make the choice of which one they would prefer. With my stuff that I do independently, the prices are the same. worldwide, so it doesn't really make a difference. So yeah, no, I don't think I would make any different choices on that point.
Sorry, I was interacting with the chat. It serves me right for not looking over here. But okay, my question for you, since we've actually had a number of traditional publishers now, is there anything your publisher does for you that you wish you were able to do for yourself?
Ooh, it's the print distribution. I mean, it's amazing. I still sell a lot of books in print, and they're able to get them into all these bookstores, across the country, or depending on whichever country it is. And that, I think, is something that I couldn't do myself, even with all the tools at our disposal now. That's really something that would be difficult to do. And I also have to give a shout out to the marketing people, like my publicist at Berkeley. She's fantastic. She knows everybody, and so my books end up sent for review all over the place, and they end up being submitted for it's like spotlights and all kind of things. And so I think when you have someone who's so good at what they do, it's really hard to duplicate that when you don't, without having that knowledge yourself. So yeah, I think they do a really, really good job.
Alrighty. Is there? Have you ever been contacted from like a reader or a fan, and it says, I absolutely loved your books," and then they tell you where they're living, and you just think to yourself, "Holy cow! I didn't know I had books for sale there."
Yeah. So when I started, this is when people still wrote letters, actual in the mail, and they put like a stamp on it. I got letters from Nigeria, and I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. I think that was my first sort of international letter came from Nigeria, and I just was like, whoa. And every so often, I get a comment on Facebook from someone in some far-flung place, and it's really exciting. And I still find it just as exciting as back then.
Yeah, I had a fan contact me on Facebook. They said, "I love these books there. I shared them with my family and friends. I hope you don't mind." And I was like, "Oh, that's great. Where are you from?" And he tells me Reykjavik. I'm like,
"Ooh,
Iceland?
cool is
Question mark?
that?"
Question mark? I put about 5 question marks on there. He's like, "Yeah, it's great." And I was like, okay. I went back to my wife and said, "You're not going to believe where I just picked up a fan over in Iceland." She's like, "You had books there?" I'm like, "You gotta love Amazon."
That's right.
Amazon, I hope you're listening, because I said that. I won't say that again. But
Oh, Jeff, it's too late. They've already blacklisted you. All right, so I'm curious, now that you've kind of dabbled in the indie side with your Rock Kiss series, it sounds like they're different genres, so maybe it's a little apples to oranges, but what has your experience been with marketing, like the trad published stuff versus just marketing on your own? Have there been any challenges?
Yeah, I think it's a little difficult to compare directly just because it was a brand new genre for me. So obviously it was a lot harder marketing it, because I had to reach out to obviously some of my readers read it, and were interested in trying these books, but then I also had to reach a whole new readership. So there's a lot of hard work on the ground, like I talked about it, with the book one, where you have to sort of tell people, hey, these books exist. So yeah, I think I'm just trying to think with it in comparison. Yeah, on this, I did have this advantage in that I know so many bloggers and reviewers at this point, and I can say to them, hey, look, I know this is not what you normally review, but do you want to have a look at it? And most of them said yes, which was, really lovely. And yeah, it is tough to compare just because it was such a different genre. Ask me if I ever self-publish paranormal, and maybe I'll have an answer.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you kind of made it hard for yourself. I think the authors who have traditionally published one series and then do some novellas in kind of the same world with side characters and self-publish those, probably easier to sell to the mailing list.
Yeah, I've always liked a challenge.
Do you think that you would do it? Would you try more self-publishing? Has it discouraged you, or was it fun?
No, it was fun. I enjoyed it. I actually am one of those people who thinks it's really good to have lots of eggs in lots of different baskets. So, I like having a bit of self-publishing. I like having my traditional deals. I like having my foreign deals and my audio, all kind of different things. I'm really sort of conservative in terms of relying on one stream of income. I think as someone who's self-employed, whose income comes from writing, it's really good to have these multiple streams. And I like having the self-published stuff as a stream of income as well.
A lot of indie authors base their entire marketing plan on frequent releases in a single series to keep ranks up. I know that you talk about how you often have deadlines to meet. Do you feel like there's sort of a minimum number of book releases that's advisable to keep yourself visible?
Well, I think it really depends on the author, and I do think it's burnout is something people have to guard against, because I think some of the schedules I've seen recently, release schedules, are just so intense. And as someone who is like, the Side Changing series turned 10 last year, so it's a decade-old series. So I've been around for a while, and I think you have to first, you have to pick a pace that works for you, that you can maintain long term. But in terms of how many books to say relevant, I do think you can still do it on one book a year. But it has to be a book that reaches a particular readership, that is going to be very loyal to you and is going to wait for you to release, the next book. For example, I read a lot of thrillers. I really like Jonathan Kellerman, and he does one book a year. That's, that is his book. And I am right there for that one book a year. I am buying it. So I do think you can do it at one, but I think it's harder, obviously, especially if you're building a career. I think three is probably like the better number if you can do it. And obviously, it's going to depend if you're working full time or if you can, what your writing speed is. I know when I started, I think I was doing 2 a year, and that was actually okay. You can still do it on 2. It was a slightly different, different market, because now things move so much faster. But yeah, I think probably 3. If you can do it on 3, I think you can make it. But again, it's going to be something, as I said, that marks you out as the author that they want to follow, as opposed to, you can't be doing potato chips, because they can get potato chips anywhere, right? You have to be this sort of gourmet cake, that your shop is the only shop they can get the gourmet cake in. So if you're doing less releases, I think you have to define yourself as an author more. Yeah.
All right. So, seeing how you have a number of different titles in the series, would you recommend waiting to release a new series once you have more than one title in it?
In the current marketplace, yes, I would. I think it's easier to build up a readership if you can release, say, 3 books. Whether you do it, sort of 1, 2, 3 close together, or 3 at the same time. Yeah, I would. But then after that, I know personally I wouldn't be able to release 3 more in like, a month's time kind of thing. So, and then at that point, you've got to set up a schedule for your readers. And I think one thing is really important. I think if you make a promise to the reader, you have to keep it. So if you say, okay, so book 4 is going to come out in 3 months' time, and you give them a date, and maybe you have a pre-order, then you got to meet it. And I think if you set up that promise and you always keep that promise, then readers are more likely to believe your promise and to wait for that book, because they know it's coming and that you're going to deliver. And I think that's particularly important if you don't want to be, sort of writing and releasing constantly. If you want to set up a sort of more stable release schedule that's a little bit slower.
So, do you feel it'd be easier to market a brand new series as opposed to keeping the existing one going?
That's an interesting question. So I obviously write a giant series. So Size Changing series is book 16, came out this year. So it's been, it's kind of a long series, just a little bit. I think when you get that long, the difficulty in marketing is, of course, people think, oh, it's too long. I can't dive into it. So in that sense, if you have something brand new that people can try, everyone wants to try the hot new thing, but you've got to sell that hot new thing to readers. They've got no investment in it at all. Whereas as opposed to a long-running series, readers already have an investment in it, so they're more likely to try it. So that's the pros and the cons. I personally think if you can do it, and I can't obviously, or I would, I think the best way to do it would be to do a long-running series, but you have trilogies where you can jump in at any point. And a writer that did this really well, Mercedes Lackey, you guys are all fantasy people, you got to recognize that name. Her Herald of Valdemar series, it has like trilogies within a longer storyline. So you can read like the Winds trilogy or the Arrows trilogy and get like a complete story, but it also slots into like a big storyline that's going on. And I think if authors can do that, that's actually really clever, because you're giving new entry points with each trilogy, while at the same time it's this huge world that, I, as a reader, I know I was so invested in the Valdemar world that I was going to dive into every new trilogy or book. Yeah.
Oh, very, very cool. Yeah, there was a number of series I enjoyed that they keep on going. I'm like, you keep releasing, I'll keep reading them. So
that's right.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's it for me. Let me hand you back to Lindsay. We'll see if we can wrap this up for you.
All right. Yeah, I think a long series is great if you can keep book one selling and keep people coming into the funnel.
Yeah.
Which it seems to work for some people, have no problem with that. And maybe some genres and subgenres lend themselves to it more. I feel like with urban fantasy or anything where you kind of have standalone novels too, rather than, I don't know, it gets complicated when it's like really one 8-book story.
Yeah, it does. As soon as you have a connection. Yeah.
But yeah, if you can keep that book one selling and keep people coming in, and then you've got 16 books for them to buy, that's great. That's like the dream. But I do love the idea of the trilogy thing too, and that's something I keep telling myself I should do. I haven't yet successfully done that, but it sounds like a good idea.
Exactly. It sounds like a good idea, but I think some of these choices are going to depend on who you are as a writer. And some of us just write endless series, and other people can write so much more compact series. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my only shot would be is if I did different sets of characters, or maybe they were all introduced already, but different main characters in the different trilogies. Because otherwise you get so much backstory and history that it's really hard for a new reader to jump into like, it's really book 9. It's not a book 1. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We've been babbling for an hour here, so I guess we better let you go. Why don't you let us know where people can find you online? And you've got a new book coming out, right? Tell us all about it.
Oh, yes. I do have a new book coming out. And why? Look, I have one right here to show you.
Oh, conveniently, right by the computer.
Conveniently, look, just right here. So this is Archangel's Viper. You should all buy it. It's really snarky and funny. And it's actually it's paranormal romance, but it has quite an urban fantasy vibe, I've been told. So, give it a go if you want something different. And just for interest, this is the UK cover, which is very different. So you can see it's a different size as well, which I find very interesting because I have 2 different publishers in the 2 different English markets. So that's out next Tuesday. So, and where can you find me? My website is nalinisingh.com, Facebook, author Nalini Singh, Twitter, Nalini Singh, and Instagram, author Nalini Singh. So just try Nalini Singh on author Nalini Singh and you'll get me.
I'm sensing a theme here.
Yeah, that's right.
Unlike the rest of us, she did her branding right, is what the theme is.
Lesson learned.
When I started on Twitter,
it's easier when your name is Nalini. Sorry.
Well, yeah, when I started on Twitter, I was like just going to stalk agents. I had no thoughts of like, this should probably be my name. It is interesting how different the covers are for geared towards different markets.
They, I have to say, like, so obviously I'm in New Zealand, and I'm just the covers. We get a mix of American and UK covers, and it is really interesting what sells in certain markets and doesn't sell in others. And I think that's actually something for indie authors to also think about. And because obviously most indies would just use the same cover across the world. But I think if you get later on in the career and you've got the money to be able to do 2 different covers, it's probably worth your while to test it out, because for whatever reason, certain covers work in one country and just don't in another. And I find that fascinating. And I also find it really interesting, the covers in the foreign markets as well, because some of them trend more towards the US and some tend more towards the UK. And it's just, you can't predict which one's going to be which until you see it.
Yeah, I think right now we're kind of limited because I think we can only put one cover up, like for all the Amazon stores. But I've heard other people say, I hope that becomes a thing that we can do, because it seems like the UK, for example, is really different often in what they like. And I think you can't even have guns, like with the thriller authors. It seems like I've heard them say, no guns on the UK covers. We don't do guns here.
Nope, it's just not. It's like watching the British mysteries and the American mysteries. They just don't have guns in the British mysteries. And so it just looks wrong when you're trying to market to their market with a whole guy with a gun on the cover. It's just, yeah.
All right. Well, cool. Well, we will let you go. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I didn't realize that this is episode 150, guys.
Ooh.
Nice. So I will put the link to your new book and your site and your Facebook over on our show at marketingsff.com, episode 150. If you guys want to come by and jump to the links.
All right. Nice to meet you, Nalini. Doing great. Keep it up.
So long, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Bye.